Hello, I'm Sean, and welcome to Case Files, Dark Earth. On this channel, I upload 2 to 3 times a week, bringing you mysterious, but absolutely true, stories from around the world. So grab yourself a cup of tea or coffee, settle in, and let's uncover the darkness hiding beneath the surface. Attila the Hun 434 to 453 AD was the leader of the ancient nomadic people known as the Huns and ruler of the Hunnic Empire, which he established. His name means little father and, according to some historians, may not have been his birth name but a term of affection and respect conferred on his accession. This name was synonymous with terror among his enemies and the general populace of the territories that his armies swept through. Attila's incursions into the regions of Germania drove the populations across the borders of the Western Roman Empire and contributed to its decline in the late 5th century AD. The influx of the Visigoths, in particular, and their later revolt against Rome, is considered a significant contributor to Rome's fall. The Visigoth victory over the Romans at the Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD was an event the Roman military never fully recovered from. Further, that victory encouraged the Huns to join the Visigoths, their former adversaries, in plundering Roman territories. The apparent weakness of Rome encouraged Attila, once he became leader of the Huns, to make and break treaties such as the Treaty of Margus in 439 AD without fear of consequences, and his wide-scale destruction of Roman cities and towns met with little or no resistance for the most part, making it clear that the Roman army was no longer the kind of invincible fighting force it once had been. Attila's ability to command a vast army of warriors often comprised of different tribes such as the Alans, Alemanni, and Ostrogoths was also in contrast to Roman generals of his time, who had difficulty keeping their non-Roman contingents under control, most clearly seen in the Roman general Litorius' campaign against the Goths in 439 AD, in which he could not stop his Hun allies from raiding the regions they passed through. Attila was a brilliant horseman and military leader, possessed a commanding presence, and held his empire together through the strength of his individual personality. He not only made the Huns the most effective fighting force of the time, but he also built a vast empire from virtually nothing in less than 10 years. At its height, this empire stretched from Central Asia across to modern-day France and down through the Danube Valley. After he died in 453 AD, his sons tried to hold his empire together but failed, and it broke apart by 469 AD. Although in the present day, his mother's name is sometimes given as Hungisung Vladiserf, her name is actually not known, and this name is considered a recent fabrication. His father's name was Mundzag, and his uncle, Rugila, also known as Rua and Ruga, was king of the Huns. As a young man, Attila, and his older brother Blida, also known as Buda, were taught archery, how to ride and care for horses, and how to fight. They were also taught Latin and Gothic to enable them to do business with the Romans and Goths. Historians are divided on how much can be said with certainty regarding Attila's early years, however, and some claim that nothing is known of his early life, not even his birth name, and nothing should be inferred based on his later accomplishments. Whether Rugila had sons to succeed him is not known, and Mundzak seems to have died early in the boys' lives, so it appears that either Blida or Attila would be Rugila's heir and succeed him as king. Therefore, their education and instruction in warfare would have prepared them for the responsibilities of leadership. Suggest that Attila and Blida may have assassinated Rugila's sons on campaign to assume power and, again, claims no such assumption should be made. Both boys are thought to have been present at Hun war councils and negotiations from an early age. Even before Attila became king, the Huns were a formidable fighting force, although they would become more so later under his rule. They were expert horsemen whose steeds, according to ancient reports, would actually fight for them in battle with teeth and hooves. When Rugila died on campaign against Constantinople in 433 AD, leadership passed to Attila and Blida. The brothers ruled jointly, each in control of their own regions and populace, and, as Lanning notes, frequently dealt with the Eastern Roman Empire, who formerly had paid the Huns as mercenaries to take care of the other tribes harassing Rome's boundaries, but now found they were paying to keep the Huns from invading. Attila and Blida together brokered the Treaty of Margus with Rome in 439 AD. This treaty continued the precedent of Rome paying off the Huns in return for peace, which would be a more or less constant stipulation in Roman-Hun relations until Attila's death. an agreement between the Huns and the Romans had already been brokered in 435 AD by the Roman general Flavius Aetius 391 to 454 AD, who had lived among the Huns as a hostage in his youth, spoke their language, and employed them to his advantage in his various power struggles in the empire. The Treaty of Margus expanded on Aetius' treaty. The Romans promised to return all Hun refugees who had fled into Roman territories, would not enter into pacts or treaties with enemies of the Huns, would establish fair trading rights and, of course, would make an annual payment of 700 pounds of gold directly to Attila and Bleda. For their part, the Huns promised not to attack Rome, not to enter into pacts or treaties with Rome's enemies, and to defend the Danube frontier and the provinces of the Roman Empire. The treaty concluded, the Romans were able to withdraw their troops from the Danube region and send them against the Vandals who were threatening Rome's provinces in Sicily and North Africa. The Huns turned their attention east after the Margus Treaty and warred against the Sassanid Empire but were repelled and driven back toward the Great Hungarian Plain, which was their home base. With the Roman troops who once guarded the border now deployed to Sicily, the Huns saw an opportunity for easy plunder. Kelly writes, as soon as Attila and Bleda received reliable intelligence that the fleet had left for Sicily, they opened their Danube offensive. They claimed the Romans had violated the Margus Treaty by not sending back all the Hun refugees in Roman territory and, further, claimed that a Roman bishop had made a secret trip into Hun territory to desecrate Hun graves and steal valuable grave goods, and they wanted this bishop turned over to them. Theodosius sent his general Flavius Aspar to try to negotiate with Attila and Bleda, but it was no use. Attila showed Aspar recently disturbed graves, but there was no way of telling whose graves they were, who had disturbed them, or what may have been taken from them. With no proof of a crime, Aspar refused to turn the bishop over to the Huns and, further, claimed he had no knowledge of Hun refugees hiding from Attila and Bleda on Roman soil. The Huns insisted, Aspar could not comply, and negotiations reached a stalemate. Aspar returned to Constantinople to report these developments to Theodosius but does not seem to have felt there was any imminent threat of a Hun invasion. The refugees in question were Huns who had fled Attila's rule and who he wanted returned before they could stir up rebellion against him. As it turned out, there were still a number of refugees living in Roman territory who would later be handed over, and the bishop Attila wanted most likely did rob the graves and would later betray the city of Margus to the Huns. So, as it happened, it would have been better if Aspar had simply handed him and the refugees over in the first place. He did not do so, however, and considering the treaty broken, Attila mobilized for war. As Aspar headed back toward Constantinople in the summer of 441 AD, Attila and Bleda drove their armies through the border regions and sacked the cities of the province of Illyricum, which were very profitable Roman trade centers. They then further violated the Treaty of Margus by riding onto that city and destroying it, with the help of the bishop who opened the gates for them. Theodosius II 401 to 450 AD then declared the treaty broken and recalled his armies from the provinces to stop the Hun rampage. Attila and Bleda responded with a full-scale invasion, sacking and destroying Roman cities all the way to within 20 miles of the Roman capital of Constantinople. The city of Naissus, birthplace of Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, was razed and would not be rebuilt for a century afterwards. The Huns had learned a great deal about Roman siege warfare from their time serving in the Roman army and expertly put this knowledge to use, literally wiping whole cities, such as Naissus, off the map. Their offensive was all the more successful because it was completely unexpected. Theodosius II had been so confident that the Huns would keep the treaty that he refused to listen to any counsel that suggested otherwise. Theodosius II, realizing he was defeated but unwilling to admit total defeat, asked for terms. The sum Rome now had to pay to keep the Huns from further destruction was more than tripled. The historian Will Durant writes, Theodosius II of the Eastern Empire and Valentinian III of the Western, both paid him tribute as a bribe to peace, disguising it among their peoples as payments for services rendered by a client king. After their Danube offensive, Attila and Bleda led their troops back home to the Great Hungarian Plain, where Bleda then vanishes from the historical record. Kelly cites the most reliable Roman account, Priscus, who writes those 3 years after the offensive, Bleda, king of the Huns, was assassinated as a result of the plots of his brother Attila. Other scholars have suggested that Bleda may have been killed on campaign but, however he died. In 445 AD, Attila became the sole leader of the Huns and the most powerful military commander in Europe. The historian Jordan 6th century AD, who wrote the only ancient account of the Goths still extant, includes their interactions with the Huns, describing Attila at length. Although Attila is almost always represented as a vicious warrior on horseback, slaughtering the multitudes, he was actually a more complex individual, as the Roman writer Priscus, who actually met and dined with Attila, presents him. Among the heathen superstitions Durant notes is the war sword Attila carried, which he claimed was left for him by the Roman god of war, Mars. This sword, according to Jordans, was discovered by accident. Attila saw Rome as a feeble adversary, and so, starting in 446 or 447 AD, he again invaded the region of Moesia, the Balkan area, destroying over 70 cities, taking survivors as slaves, and sending the loot back to his stronghold at the city of Buda, possibly Budapest in present-day Hungary, though this claim has been contested by some historians. He was considered invincible and, in Durant's words, having bled the east to his heart's content, Attila turned to the west and found an unusual excuse for war. In 450 AD, Valentinian's sister, Honoria, was seeking to escape an arranged marriage with a Roman senator and sent a message to Attila, along with her engagement ring, asking for his help. Although she may never have intended anything like marriage, Attila chose to interpret her message and ring as a betrothal and sent back his terms as one half of the Western Empire for her dowry. Valentinian, when he discovered what his sister had done, sent messengers to Attila telling him it was all a mistake, and there was no proposal, no marriage, and no dowry to be negotiated. Attila asserted that the marriage proposal was legitimate, that he had accepted and would claim his bride, and mobilized his army to march on Rome. In 451 AD he began his conquests with an army of probably about 200,000 men, although sources, such as Jordan's, set the number higher at 500,000. They took Gallia Belgica province, modern-day Belgium, easily and moved on to ravage the land. The only time Attila had been turned back from a conquest was by the Sassanids, and his reputation for slaughter and invincibility preceded him as he moved through Gaul. The reputation of the Huns for brutality and indiscriminate slaughter was well known and sent the people of the land fleeing for their lives with whatever they could carry. The Roman writer Ammianus Marcellinus 330–391 AD wrote of the Huns in his History of Rome. The Hun army was one enormous cavalry unit that struck their adversaries quickly, neither asking for nor offering any mercy. It is little wonder that no general was especially eager to engage the Hun forces under Attila. Kelly notes how the Huns appeared as if from nowhere and melted away, leaving only destruction behind them. It was impossible to establish an effective early warning system. Attila took Trier and Metz without opposition, massacred the citizens, and then rode on, destroying everything in his path. He was finally met in battle by the combined forces of the Romans under Flavius Aetius, who understood Hun strategy and tactics, and the Visigoths under Theodoric I, reigned 418 to 451 AD on the Cataluanian plains. This engagement is known as the Battle of Cataluanian Fields or the Battle of Chalons, and has been described as one of the bloodiest military conflicts in history and the first time Attila's forces were halted in an invasion of Europe. Although Attila had been stopped in his invasion, he had hardly been defeated. The Romans claimed the victory, however, and returned to their homes in the hope that Attila would now harass someone else. In 452 AD, though, he returned to invade Italy and claim the bride who had promised him her hand in marriage. Here, as in Gaul, he spread a wide swath of destruction and so completely sacked the city of Aquileia that not only would it never rise again, but no one even knew where it had stood. The people of Italy, as the Gauls before them, were terrified of the Hun invasion, but now, unlike the year before, Aetius did not have an army of sufficient force to stop Attila. Whole populations fled their cities and villages for safer regions and, in fact, this was how the city of Venice came to rise from the marshes to become the city of bridges among other names, as it is known as in the present day. In flight from Attila's army, people took refuge on what solid ground they could find in the watery regions they felt Attila would bypass. They chose wisely, in that Attila's forces avoided the lagoons and marched on toward more attractive grounds. For reasons no one knows, the Hun stopped at the Po River. A famine had been plaguing Italy for the better part of 2 years, and quite possibly Attila had simply run out of supplies. It has also been suggested that plague had broken out in Attila's army, which forced him to abandon his plans. Further, there is the suggestion that his men cautioned him against continuing on to sack Rome. The Gothic commander Alaric 394–410 AD had sacked Rome in 410 AD and died shortly afterwards. Superstition suggested Alaric's death was a direct result of his assault on such a prestigious city. It is also possible that some kind of peace was agreed to between Attila and Rome. Valentinian sent Pope Leo I with a delegation to seek terms from Attila, but the details of that meeting is unknown. All that is clear is that, following the meeting with Leo I and his delegates, Attila turned back and retreated to his stronghold in Hungary. Whether he remembered Honoria and the dowry is unknown. Durant and others claim he threatened to return to Italy for Honoria unless she was sent to him, but this is not clear from the primary sources. But he soon took a new, young wife, in 453 AD, named Ildico. Durant writes he celebrated the wedding with an unusual indulgence in food and drink. On the morrow he was found dead in bed beside his young wife. He had burst a blood vessel, and the blood in his throat had choked him to death. As with Alexander the Great, alternative versions of Attila's death have been suggested, but Durant's version follows that of Priscus, which is the first given and considered the most reliable. Other versions include assassination by Ildico, a conspiracy involving the Emperor of the East, Mercian 450–457 AD, who had Attila killed, an accidental death by alcohol poisoning or esophageal hemorrhage from drinking too much. The entire army fell into intense grief over the loss of their leader. Attila's horsemen smeared their faces with blood and rode slowly, in a steady circle, around the tent which held his body. Following his funeral, his empire was divided among his sons who fought with each other for the greatest share, squandered their resources, and allowed the kingdom to fall apart. By 469 AD, only 16 years after Attila's death, the empire was gone. Attila's memory, however, lives on as one of the greatest military leaders of all time. He has been depicted since his death as the epitome of a warrior king, and recent portrayals follow this traditional image. Dramatic feature films which reference him, even in passing, present him as a powerful warrior, and even in the Hollywood comedy Night at the Museum, from 2006 AD, Attila the Hun is depicted as a formidable force. Attila the Hun was the greatest battle captain of his age, his reputation striking terror in his enemies who both feared and respected the Scourge of God. More than 1500 years later, his name remains synonymous with aggressive cavalry and the warrior ethos. If this story held your attention, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Hit the bell icon to be notified when the next case is uncovered.